Hello, everyone. So, as most of you probably know, I'm an agorist, meaning that I'm an anarchist and I seek to establish a stateless society through economic decentralization. Now, the reason I mention this is because many people ask me if I have problems with other methods or my opinions on other methods of establishing my end goals. Generally speaking, those actions are revolution or voting to try and shrink the state to irrelevance, as supporters of partyarchy claim. Well, my position on this would actually apply to any ideology, not just the ones that seek to abolish the state. But the reason I mention it specifically in reference to anarchism is because it's a common disagreement. In fact, Mr. Dapperton, the biggest ANCAP channel on YouTube, is a supporter of utilizing voting to try and shrink the state, and many are on his side, since many ANCAPs take influence from Hans Hermann Hoppe, whose philosophy, more so than other voluntarists or individualists, focuses on social cohesion as well, and therefore is skeptical of abolishing the state without more popularity of anarcho-capitalism in culture, but more on that later. Well, firstly, unlike most ANCAPs, I don't believe that a revolution is principally inconsistent or unjustifiable, because the state inherently is an entity which violates our rights and has put themselves in a position where no means of peaceful resolution can be reached for your conflicts with them. Plus, the government operates by initiating violence against people for everything that it does. The only time where it could be argued that violence against government employees is inherently unjustifiable is in a country which has an industry that's centrally planned and forces people against their will to become laborers for it. Because if government employees don't have a choice but to become government employees, then you can't necessarily blame the employees for what they do to you, because they have a gun to their head forcing them to do something to you which is unethical. At that point, you could only justifiably strike out against the people who are coercing the employees to be in that position to begin with, which would be that government's politicians. My problem with revolution is entirely on a practical level, because I don't see it as an effective method of achieving political change, or at least in a stable framework. Revolution has historically been notorious for exploitation by despots seeking to achieve political power. And the reason this is so easy after a revolution is that a revolution doesn't actually overthrow the system which preceded it. It merely replaces the current standing politicians with the people who won the revolution. So, for example, if a revolution were to happen today in the United States would still be a Republican democracy afterward. Why revolutions tend to create such drastic change is exactly the reason why despotic tyrants are so attracted to them. The figures of political power are replaced by the revolutionaries after the revolution. So a tyrannical leader leads a revolution, and the revolutionaries fill the seats of Congress, the Supreme Court, and everyone in the executive branch. And all the revolutionaries are loyal to the despot, and now you've basically got yourself a totalitarian dictatorship. I mean, name a revolution where this didn't happen. And I know many people will say the American Revolution, but if you look at Washington's presidency, he was remarkably authoritarian in contrast to what the colonists had just revolted against England over. Two great examples being his tax on whiskey, which led to the Whiskey Rebellion of 1791, which was led mostly by former revolutionaries that fought alongside Washington, who saw Washington as developing into the same sort of tyrant they'd just fought against. which I think is more than satisfactory of an explanation. But then he signed the Sedition Act of 1796, which allowed the government to fully strip all citizens of their so-called constitutional rights if they declare an emergency, which they could do at any time at their own discretion. So no, the American Revolution was just like any other revolution. The only reason we see it as being any different is because victors write the history books. But also with revolution, even if you're going to ignore the emergent tyranny problem, you're still left with the fact that you need a remarkably large amount of the population to support your cause. And not only this, but people who are resourceful and are so dedicated to your cause that they're willing to risk being imprisoned by the state or possibly being killed. And you're just not going to be able to organize something like this without a large amount of money and resources, more than a fringe group would be able to put together. So a group of revolutionaries from a radical ideology would need to branch out to ideologies which they oppose but are willing to help them, and wealthy investors who may have ideological sympathies, both of which only increase the already high likelihood that their movement is going to lead to despotism. Now, to the problems with democracy, or using the democratic process to try and affect the political climate. I have an entire video going over why democracy is inherently unethical, why it only exists as a product of the state, and why it's not a libertarian ideal. So I won't be spending much time going over that aspect of my disagreement with democracy. I will, however, drop a link in the description to that video so you can see it for yourself. But firstly, there's game theory, which statistically proves that individual votes are irrelevant by a margin of roughly 1 to 60 million. It's also an exercise of futility, as any state or centralized monopoly on arbitration can simply choose not to respect an election with enough support for doing so among the figures running it. And a Republican democracy has even more issues in this regard, since you're voting for people whom you have no idea what their true intentions are, and historically, every single leader has lied about at least one of their promises they made on the campaign. This isn't a problem which can be fixed, by the way, for the same reason that the state is inherently illegitimate. There's no actual voluntary basis for which people give their consent to the state to impose its will onto people. Politicians, therefore, don't actually have any terms which they need to follow on the campaign trail. They could say whatever they want and whatever it takes to win the most amount of people to vote for them, and they have no obligation to honor anything that they say because there's no actual written agreement which binds them to those things. In order for there to be a contractual agreement in this way, the state would have to force people at gunpoint to sign an agreement and vote, removing the illusion of choice that they've created with the false notion that you implicitly can agree to their terms, and exposing the state's inherently tyrannical nature, which they won't do because that will lead to mass dissent. If they made it so when a ruler is elected and everyone in the country signs a contract which they aren't obligated to sign, and if one person didn't sign, that election was illegitimate, there wouldn't be politicians, because there's no leader everyone would universally agree with. That's literally impossible for that to be the case because of anarchist politics. So, rather unsurprisingly, when you allow a gang of criminals to do whatever they want to whoever they want at their own discretion, they lie and swindle people for their own benefit. So, what is counter-economics, and why do I support it? Well, that's something which I explain quite a bit in my videos, but I guess I'll do it again. Counter-economics, or agorism, is the exchange of commodities in either gray or black markets. Gray markets being activities which are legal by law as long as they're done with taxation, and black markets are exchanges which are illegal but not unethical. And these exchanges are done with decentralized currency. The best working example of decentralization is cryptocurrency, which is why cryptocurrency is so closely associated with agorism. The reason this will work is because of the decentralized nature of cryptocurrency. It can't be tracked, so it can't be outlawed or taxed, which is why China and Russia have both already outlawed it, and the crypto market in their countries respectively have grown. Because it can't be controlled by the government and its trade is entirely independent while being self-sustaining, that means that if this were to ever take off, which all that's needed for it to do so is an event to occur which encourages a mass investment into cryptocurrency, since the value of crypto directly correlates with the activity of the blockchain network. There are a variety of ways in which this event could occur, but the most concrete one is the collapse of the US dollar, since this will cause people to try and put all their money into more stable assets, which are holding their value better, and cryptocurrency is not affected by fiat, so this increase in activity will cause the value of cryptocurrencies to increase, which will cause more people to put their assets into cryptocurrency. But because of this, that means that people can start businesses and people can invest capital into this market, and the government can't do anything about it. So you can entirely create a social infrastructure, and the government will have absolutely no way to control it. Keep in mind that fiat economies historically have had a 100% failure rate. So if the US dollar doesn't collapse within the next few years, which I find incredibly unlikely seeing with what's going on regarding China and their gold-backed petrocurrency, it will eventually happen. So, hands down, the most effective method of achieving political change will be through counter-economics. In fact, no action is even required because it doesn't matter what your ideology is. You'll trade in crypto because it benefits you directly, since it's a more profitable medium of exchange. And you also don't have to worry about centralization in the future or the rise of a despot, because after the economy is decentralized, how would you even begin to establish a monopoly on arbitration? You can't tell who's trading with who and how they're trading, and as long as you don't know that, you can't stop people from trading. And if you can't stop people from trading, you can't establish a monopoly on arbitration, since you can't force competitors out of that industry. So not only will agorism lead to the abolition of the state, but it will also ensure that a state can never form again. So even if democracy or revolution were viable methods of achieving political change, I would still be an agorist, simply because of how much more efficient agorism is, how little risk is involved, and the fact that achieving my end goal through agorism will happen necessarily just by waiting. And the stateless voluntarist society will be a permanent social structure which can never revert back to statism if achieved through economic decentralization. Neither of the other options could create these same results. So, what would be a viable path forward if you're a statist? Well, as mentioned earlier, it doesn't appear that there is one. You don't have anything to be afraid of, though, because literally everyone gets their way in a voluntarist society. Unless you're a fascist, I guess.